My guest today is Dr. Trent Stellingwerff PhD, the Director of the Innovation and Research Division at the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific. An experienced researcher, Trent has more than 40 peer-reviewed scientific publications and is currently on the editorial board for the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance and the International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism. He has co-authored 6 book chapters focusing on the role that nutrition can play in supporting elite athlete performance, including a chapter on nutrition for the endurance athlete for the newest version of the 2013 IOC Sports Nutrition Encyclopedia. Trent has attended numerous World Championships and Olympic Games as part of Team Canada's integrated support team and consults with several Olympic athletes from around the world, including his wife Hillary, who competed for Canada in the 1500 meter at the 2012 Games. Trent, really appreciate you carving out the time today.
Thanks for having me on, Mark.
Terrific. Well, listen, can we maybe start by sharing with listeners a little more about how you first got interested in research and endurance sport and your journey to CSI Pacific?
Yeah, wow. So in high school, I was a track and field athlete and was blessed to run decently well in circles and got a scholarship option to the U.S. And there at Cornell University, I majored in nutrition and minored in exercise science. And I think that the passion and link that I saw then at Cornell already in studying something that can directly impact, at least initially, my own performance and then others' performance was just completely natural to me and worthwhile to pursue. So out of that, I did a master's and PhD at the University of Guelph and then a postdoc in research at Maastricht University in the Netherlands and with Luc Van Loon in protein research. And then for 5 years, I was the science, innovation, and research lead for Power Bar in Lausanne, Switzerland. It was a Nestle brand. They've since sold. And then throughout that whole time, my wife was an international level runner, and I was involved with endurance sports still. And then a job opened up here in 2011 at the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific. So I live here in Victoria, Canada, and we made the move back to Canada. Both my wife and I were born and raised in Ontario, near Sarnia, Ontario, and now bought a house and we have a family and we've settled here in Victoria. So a long answer, but maybe some context for the listener to appreciate my own journey.
Absolutely, and Victoria, a pretty nice place to settle as well, so looks like things turning out well there. Now, we're going to talk endurance training here, fueling and body composition, but before we do, history was made this past weekend at the Berlin Marathon, and Trent, I caught a tweet you sent out last week about sort of comparing the Berlin Marathon, or at least saying you're going to stay up to watch it, and comparing it to the Super Bowl for marathoners. And then, of course, Eliud Kipchoge's, he sets the world record, phenomenal performance, perhaps the greatest for men's marathon. So for you, as a fan, as a sports scientist, what was that like watching all that unfold?
Yeah, it was pretty mind-blowing. Even someone who knows the intimate specifics of the event and is in contact with some of the people that work with Kipchoge and knowing that he was on form, and then 3 days out seeing the weather, which can be a huge impact on marathon performance, and seeing it looked pretty much perfect. Maybe it was 1 or 2 degrees too warm, but it was really good. You knew he was lined up for something special. I didn't think it would be that special, especially when his two rabbits had dropped out by 15K and his third rabbit only got to 26K. So basically the last 17K or 10 miles of the race, he was completely isolated and alone. And it was in that period he actually accelerated. If you look at my Twitter feed, you can kind of see my emotions. I was worried he was overcooking it in the middle. He was being too aggressive. I even wrote patience, because marathoning doesn't really begin till 30K into the race, 32K into the race, but obviously he's done a bunch of these. He knows his body. He knew the form he was in because he just continued to accelerate all the way to the finish line. I actually think it was slightly better than his Breaking 2 performance, where he went 2 hours and 25 seconds. Now, that was a contrived environment. It did not count for a world record because they had rabbits go in and out.
Yeah.
And they had mopeds give him his bottles like on the fly, and that's also against the IAAF rules. You have to take them from a table. So there are 2 instances there where it didn't count. But I actually think his 2:01:39 is better than that performance in Breaking 2. It was truly mind blowing. I thought he would break the record. I certainly did not think he would break 2:02. So here we are, and we're in a new era.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, that 4:38 per mile. I mean, how freakish is that pace, really?
It's 69 seconds a lap, and there's very few people that can run one lap on the track in 69 seconds. It's phenomenal. My wife's retired now. She's a 2-time Olympian. She's a middle distance runner, and in her peak, she couldn't do 3 kilometers at that pace, and he's going 42.2. So it's just hard to wrap your head around that. His last half marathon was 60 minutes and 38 seconds or something like that, which is well under the Canadian record for the half marathon. So
wow,
and he's just running that off the back end, right? So it is pretty phenomenal. And how much of that is the new shoes that they launched a year and a half ago? How much of that is optimizing fueling? How much of that is an incredible training program? Bits of it have been released. I've certainly analyzed his training program. How much of it is 10 years or 15 years of just consistent training, which he does. He's rarely gotten injured, if at all. And then finally, I think a huge confounding factor is his just unbelievable belief in himself. His mindset is phenomenal. And I do think his ability and what he did for that breaking 2 attempt, that almost breaking 2 attempt, brought his headspace to a whole other spot where now he can go out in 61 minutes flat, and it's not crazy. It's I'm going to attack this off the back end rather than being mentally scared of those types of early splits.
Yeah, it's incredible, all those different factors, and of course the mindset, as you mentioned, just being a huge part of that. And dovetails into my next question for you about fueling for elite endurance athletes. And maybe you can get listeners all on the same page here and do a sort of a quick physiology review. For an athlete like Kipchoge or in that rank, what's the primary fuel that they're using during a race, and what would a fueling strategy look like for them?
Yeah, no, for sure. There's a lot of misconceptions and in this space, and a lot of it has to do with the limited character count you have on Twitter, and how pretty much nothing in life is black and white. It's always on shades of gray, and the context is so important. So that said, are the elite of the elites, these guys like Kipchoge and Reed Coolsats of the world, they are running so fast that their primary fuel of what they're using is carbohydrate. To the point that they can run close to 90% of VO2 max for that 2 hours or 2 hours and 10 minutes. Your recreational athletes who do a 4-hour marathon are running more around 50 to 60% of VO2 max. And in those situations, they are using much more fat and fat oxidation as a fuel. But in the elites, it is almost exclusively carbohydrate oxidation that fuels the entire marathon. And of course, the marathon is one of the longest events in the Olympics. And so all events and sports under that are definitely carbohydrate dependent. There's another value of being carbohydrate dependent is that it is slightly more efficient. You use slightly less oxygen, breathing in oxygen, that is, to oxidize carbohydrate than you do to oxidize fat. And although it's only percentage points difference, very small shifts towards carbohydrate oxidation theoretically can give 1 to 2 minute improvements in performance. So yes, endurance training is important. A byproduct of endurance training is increased mitochondria, and a byproduct of that is these athletes are indeed very good at fat oxidation. But it's a byproduct. The key on race day is to really, in these elite of the elites, maximize carb oxidation all the way through. So they'll have a high carb breakfast, a high carb meal the night before, and then they will fuel throughout the entire marathon. Kipchoge took bottles every single aid station. He bobbled one bottle at the 40-kilometer aid station. I noticed that, but he was close enough to home with 2K to go. It probably didn't bother him. I know he uses Morton, a sports drink company out of Scandinavia, that supposedly has new technology to even deliver more carbohydrate per hour than your regular sports drinks.
Interesting.
Or so they claim. I've yet to see a peer-reviewed publication on it. but their claim is that they use a glucose fructose blend, which most of the sports drinks do, because there's separate intestinal transporters for glucose and fructose, so you can take on more and have less GI upset. But they also claim that they use an encapsulation method, in that by encapsulating the carbohydrate, you're able to get it through the stomach and into the intestine at higher rates and at higher concentrations without causing GI side effects. So it's intriguing. It's theoretically plausible. But in anything in life, I'm ultra interested, but also always cautious until I see the scientific evidence. That said, I do know a lot of athletes that have used Morton, swear by that it works pretty well. And I know Kipchoge used it to fuel his marathons attempts, both for the Nike Breaking 2 as well as yesterday in Berlin. So hopefully that gives a little bit of
definitely
rationale, background, and understanding as to why the elite of the elites do try to maximize this part of their fueling program.
And in terms of that nuance, Trent, between sort of that competition nutrition versus training day nutrition, the role of glycogen availability as a training regulator has definitely increased over the last decade. So, for someone like Kipchoge, what would that potentially look like during various training blocks? Would elite endurance athletes like himself be, using targeted training sessions with lower carb availability to help with any training adaptations, or where are we at there?
Yeah, so historically, 10 plus 15 years ago, your sport nutrition consensus statements were all about maximizing carbs for everything. The last few consensus statements, and certainly the best experts in the field, do not support that. Everything is about the context of the situation and what you're looking to benefit and get out of it. Certainly in my 2 marathons, when I was training for marathons, I just generally in my diet, I ate a lot more carbs. Now I'm lucky to get out for 2 or 3 runs a week with 2 young boys, and
sure.
and I eat way less carbs. I just dial it back. But that doesn't. So I'm not anti or pro carbs. I'm all about the right amount for the right context and the right situation.
Absolutely.
So what's come out of that is the idea that for training, just like when you go to altitude and you limit oxygen, there's time in training when you can manipulate your diet to have training bouts where muscle glycogen might actually be low at the start of the training bout. Or you wake up in the morning and you just have a cup of coffee and you go out the door on a fasted training bout. In both of those situations, you might take the same number of minutes of training, but you've done that under a lower carbohydrate environment. And there's a whole host of studies out now with muscle biopsies and molecular biology showing that for the endurance phenotype, that stress that you get from training with low carbohydrate may increase the training adaptation you get, may stimulate more mitochondria to be made, may stimulate more capillaries to be made as 2 really important outcomes. May also stimulate the carbohydrate transporters and uptake mechanisms. You certainly still race on race day with high carb. You may do very specific high intensity sessions with high carb, but periodically throughout the training program, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, you might purposely include low carbohydrate sessions. So it's not chronically low. It's just periodically and strategically low carb. Now, when you really dig into the literature, I think the training adaptation and biopsy data is pretty consistent. Yes, low carbohydrate availability training increases markers of adaptation. But showing increases in markers of adaptation, despite biopsies and molecular biology, it tends to be easier than showing improved performance.
Gotcha.
And so the performance data is more equivocal. It's not as consistent. And part of that might be if you try to control, if you have a diet that has a 3 or 4 week training block and you try to control the nutrition for 3 or 4 weeks, it is insane to try and do that in a study. The amount of work that you need to do is quite phenomenal. And during that 4 weeks, you might only have 3 or 4 low carb training sessions per week. So you're only looking at the impact of maybe 10 or 15 low carb sessions in your study design, despite a mountain of work. And so it is really quite challenging to try and prove some of those outcomes. But at least as a theoretical basis, it has pretty strong underpinnings. I've used it strategically with different athletes that I've worked with, and at least there, anecdotally, the feedback has been positive. I don't know if Kipchoge strategically uses low carbohydrate availability training, but my wife spent time in Africa. We certainly know a fair amount about the African training, and there is a cultural context of them doing a lot of morning fasted runs. They'll get up, they'll knock out a 30K run off a cup of tea, and then they'll come home and have breakfast.
Wow.
Furthermore, when they're running 200 to 240 kilometers a week with marathon specific sessions at altitude, which altitude increases your glycogen utilization, and they'll have marathon specific sessions of 30 to 40 kilometers in duration, there's no doubt with that type of training program that there is a large majority of it being done at low carbohydrate availability, because they're running so much they can't eat enough carbs, and they're doing doubles and triples, and so whether it's strategic or whether it's just a product of the insane training program, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. I mean, so many different factors at play there, and it sort of leads into my next question for you around the nutritional periodization, and of course the concept of body composition periodization, which yourself, you studied in the case study, body composition periodization in Olympic level female middle distance runners over a 9-year career. Can you tell folks a little bit how this project came about, and then maybe we can define body composition periodization as well?
Yeah, you bet. So actually, just before the Skype, I was working on a draft review paper that'll come out in the coming months, and on a nutrition periodization framework, and it's being written by myself, Dr. James Morton at a Liverpool University, who's Team Sky's lead nutritionist, and then Louise Burke out of the Australian Institute of Sport. So stay tuned. We're going to try and develop a macro, a meso, and a micro framework to allow professionals in this field to ask the right types of questions on what this might look like.
Fantastic.
So within the meso periodization of nutrition, meso being weeks to months, macro periodization being weeks to months, body composition periodization certainly falls into that space. I did have a tweet earlier this week around a hierarchy of body composition and body composition periodization. I personally think that this should only be attempted and discussed in the elite of the elite athletes whose nutrition skills and expertise are also elite for an athlete. There's so many other things that developing athletes, junior athletes can focus on before thinking and discussing body composition and body weight or any of these other constructs, as it might actually lead them down a pretty poor path around belief effects and body image and eating disorders and disordered eating. So I just want to raise that.
Great point.
That said, with our elites that have good foundational skills, great nutrition skills, who have very good, strong, sound examination of their own body image, this is something we will talk to them about. And to me, body composition periodization is, to define it, is the strategic and healthy approach to manipulating energy expenditure and energy intake, so that for the majority of the year, the athletes in a heavier or a higher body composition state, and for very targeted performances of the year, we try to bring them to an individualized, performance-specific body composition. There's a bunch of key words in there, like health. Health needs to dictate and drive this. Specific words around strategic, specific words around targeted, and that athletes, just like they only peak in endurance sport anyways, maybe once or twice a year, it also they should only be thinking about having performance body compositions once or twice a year. So that's the idea and the concept. The way this project came about, it was something in the back of my head as an intervention, probably starting 10, 15 years ago. My wife's an international level middle distance athlete. We had probably 60 or 80 anthro measurements over a 9-year career, including performance outcomes, including metabolic testing, including health outcomes, blood work. And so it was pretty easy to retrospectively go back and analyze that and look at the fluctuations, the strategic fluctuations in her skin folds and in her body composition throughout her career.
Yeah, it was definitely fascinating to see the graphs there and the highs and lows and the progressions throughout the course of her career. And is this something that's more important potentially for female endurance athletes, or just as important in men as well?
No, I think it's equally as important. 3 years ago, the International Olympic Committee got together and have reframed the idea of around energy availability and moved on from the concept of female athlete triad, which a lot of folks have heard. And there's a ton of really great science there, and we at all should not dismiss it. And females have very specific outcomes when it comes to energy availability. But the new term that we use now is RED-S, which is relative energy deficiency in sport. It captures both health and performance outcomes and captures both males and females. We have a publication earlier this year featuring 59 world-class endurance athletes. I think probably maybe 15 or 20 of them made the Rio Olympics. They're all runners or race walkers, and we studied them up in Flagstaff, Arizona at an altitude camp. And in that cohort, females with amenorrhea, so lack of a normal menstrual cycle, and males in the lowest quartile of testosterone, so they weren't even clinically low, but they were just in the lowest quartile, had 4.5 times the amount of stress fracture rate. And so, yes, this is very much as much a male issue as a female issue. I use the word issue. In fact, maybe I should say gap, because a gap is a gift. So if you are amenorrheic or you are a male with lower testosterone, it's not even clinically low, but just in the lowest quartile of the clinical range, and you have a history of stress fractures, is a wonderful opportunity to correct your nutrition and potentially get your injury rate lower and get back on track.
Yeah, it's very well said. And actually had Jen Saigo on perhaps a month ago talking about energy availability and REDs and sprinters. So it was really fascinating stuff as well, and sort of more power sports. But if we keep talking here on the endurance side of things, in terms of benefits from a periodized body composition approach, things around injury reduction, illness risk in athletes, are there some gains to be made there potentially? Yeah,
I mean, there's a whole host of observational and correlation-based data, mainly in the female athlete triad field, showing females with amenorrhea or lack of a normal menstrual cycle having significant increases in injury and illness outcomes. So definitely that could be something to consider. I also think in the early 80s, Bosco has a couple of classic papers where over a 2 to 3 week period, he had athletes chronically wear 5 or 10% extra body weight in weighted vests. And so they had to walk around, they had to do everything with these weighted vests on.
Okay.
And I make it was like a throwaway line in the body comp 9-year body comp nutrition periodization paper. I had word count limits, but this classic work by Bosco showed just with chronic overload of weight, once you take the weight off, there was significant improvements in jump outcomes and performance outcomes, and everything else. And now he was putting 5 to 10% of body weight on, and that did come at a increased injury cost just in terms of trying to train with weighted vests.
Yep.
But I think that there's also a significant advantage to training 8, 9, 10 months a year, 3 or 4% heavier. You're training your heart, your muscles, your lungs to carry that extra body weight. It's a training stimulus. And if you run 100K a week, you take 100,000 steps. Each step is 3 to 4 times your body weight. You add 2 or 3% body weight on that. The total amount of neuromuscular load is significantly more. And then when you periodize, and every single year you can periodize the body composition, again, an elite concept, down for you get a performance benefit just from neuromuscular loading parameters. At least I believe it, and I think that there's a benefit there as well. And a lot of athletes early in their career, high school athletes, might lose a lot of body weight, and they see a performance trend benefit. But then they just pin themselves down there. They have nowhere to go. They get skinnier and skinnier, and that's when you run into very significant health troubles. Instead of having I say that to some people, a boost of performance one time in your career, why not be way more healthier? And we can periodize it for every single spring and summer, right? So it's a newer concept. There is validation that's required for this, but there's a lot of I think underpinning and logic to this. But again, it's only something that I think the elite of the elite athletes should be considering with their nutrition team and with their health team and with a team of professionals.
Definitely, yeah, very well said. And you're right in a sense that oftentimes athletes, pushing hard, if they want to improve body composition, you just keep training harder and keep reducing caloric intake drastically. And as you mentioned, it can create a lot of issues. So what type of caloric reduction were you aiming for during these periods? And potentially what type of body weight loss per week was the goal? Yeah,
it's tiny and it's subtle. There's a couple of papers that have come out in the last 2 months showing how as little as 300 to 400 calorie mismatch within a day over a prolonged period of time also results in REDs. So adverse hormonal profile, low testosterone, lack of menstrual cycle in females. And so micro-periodization, within day periodization of energy, in other words, don't skip breakfast kind of mentality, is really important. And just 300 calories over a prolonged time can have that effect. And I know 300 calories doesn't sound like much. It's smaller than what we can actually measure on an individual level because energy intake measurements are so challenging.
For sure.
And it's it could be a smoothie. And indeed, on a one-off one day, it's 300 calories is nothing. But multiply that by 365 days, and it's 110,000 calories missing over the year. It's about a month of eating.
Wow.
So when you flip it that way and you say to the athlete, well, okay, let's not eat for the month of March, they're going to look at you like you're crazy.
For sure.
But that's what it is, because it's small, it's subtle, it's like Chinese water torture. It's just a little bit every single day, but it's a mismatch. And so when doing body comp optimization, I tend to try and work with athletes in that range of no more than 300 or 400 kcals per day. It's really hard to measure that. I don't even attempt it, but I'll show pictures and diagrams of different examples of what 300 or 400 kcals might look like. Mm-hmm. We try to periodize it to the easier training days rather than the hard days, because on the hard days you want to perform really well in your training and you need to recover. We'll use indicators like hunger pains, irritability, training quality, as well as body weight tracking to try and help individualize and optimize that over time. And at the very most, we're only looking at maybe 0.5 to 0.8% of body weight per week. And so you do need some time to do this. Usually it's 6 to 8 weeks out from a championship season or a targeted, summer season of racing. And you might start there and start to put this intervention in and try to work on things. It's not drastic, it's subtle. I will also stress though, at any point, if I had an athlete that has a history of poor testosterone, a history of stress fractures, and a history of stress fractures is 2 or more, mm-hmm. or lack of a menstrual cycle, or any indicators of disordered eating or eating disorders, there's no way I'm gonna want to work with them in this space. If we just keep them weight stable and healthy, they will adapt to training way better. they will perform way better. And so I think it's really important to think about when and where you might use this, but also when and where it's not indicated to use this. When you think about energy availability, it's different than energy balance. Energy availability is energy intake minus exercise energy expenditure. And so it's two parameters that the athlete has full control over: energy intake and exercise energy expenditure. It does not feature BMR or thermic effect of food or all these things that are vague notions to the athlete. So if whatever's left over after you exercise from energy intake is what energy is available for your body to work optimally. And if there's very little left over, guess what? We evolved as humans. That energy is going to go to your brain and your organs. It doesn't care about your muscles. It doesn't care about making mitochondria. It doesn't care about your bones. It's going to prioritize that little bit of energy you've left over to keeping you alive. And so I think there's an energy prioritization, availability prioritization concept that's probably going to get a lot more research in the next few years, and understanding how I've had athletes who, a female athlete who had a menstrual cycle in 3 years complaining that her fingernails don't grow. And I'm like, listen, in terms of the prioritization of energy, it's probably number 1,000 on the list, right?
Definitely.
So again, it's a concept that is intriguing, but it needs to be in the right place at the right time. And I've had interventions with athletes who come in and want to talk body comp periodization with me. And over time, I reverse them and talk about just health stability in terms of sex hormone stability. And, a year or two later, they're running faster than they've ever run before because we're able to get their health back on track. So to me, health trumps any and all of this.
Yeah, great point there. Definitely context so important in all of this. And of course, just laying down those fundamentals, which, even at elite levels can often be sometimes lacking. So really, really great point there. And, in looking at the case study, I was also really intrigued because, the body composition is improving, the athlete's improving in leanness over time. So if circling back to the concept of periodized body composition, is obviously something an athlete's doing it in a healthy manner and has all those nutritional fundamentals in place. How can that actually potentially help the athlete in terms of getting leaner, as the years go by in their career?
Yeah, I think optimizing body composition is a career project. And I've seen again and again and again the athletes, and there's indirect data to support this, the athletes that have adequate and normal continuous sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, progesterone for females, because they aren't in energy deficits, they are the leanest athletes that we work with. And so there's a really good classic paper, Dutz et al. Dan Bernadotte is the senior author. It's 2001 MSSE, I believe, off the top of my head, where they looked at world-class elite females in middle distance, long distance, rhythmic gymnastics, and just classic normal gymnastics. And in that paper, they showed the middle distance runners were closest to energy balance, and they were the leanest athletes.
Interesting.
The athletes, the rhythmic gymnasts on average were at a negative 600 calories per day, energy balance, and they had the highest percent body fat. And even though they were, quote unquote, probably trying the hardest to lean out. And again, evolutionary biology makes really good sense. It's only recently where we've evolved to not have famines.
Yeah.
As humans, and actually as mammals, we're impressively good at putting on body fat to survive famines. When we go into starvation mode, the body very quickly, within a week, starts to shut down basal metabolic rate and starts to change the hormonal milieu and endocrine system to go into a storage mode rather than an oxidation mode. That's great for famines. Our modern world doesn't feature many famines anymore, so
not so great for performance, right?
Correct. And so the leanest athletes I have, the shredded athletes I have, they're the ones with normal menstrual cycles and the males with good testosterone values, and they're eating 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day, whatever's required. and they get leaner and leaner as their careers progress, right up into their 30s. And it's just a constant healthy approach to body comp. The thing to flip out of that, though, as well for us as practitioners and coaches, it's really important to realize that you also can't judge a book by its cover. Because of the study I just mentioned and other data, indirect and direct, the athletes with the highest percent body fat were the ones in the largest negative calorie balance. The shredded athletes were the ones that were the most healthy. And so I've heard comments before, oh, look at that athlete. Oh, she must be having an eating disorder. And I'm like, you don't know that. She might be the healthiest athlete here.
Exactly.
And it's just really important to not judge a book by its cover, to understand all these confounding factors before making rash judgments or assumptions. So I'll leave it there.
For sure. And then, another really interesting thing in the study was the ability to maintain lean muscle mass whilst getting leaner. And, as you noted, the mid-thigh girth during the competition phases, being able to maintain that, and obviously as that translates to performance, is that just an end result of being able to do this, really well and taking all that time to be periodizing this appropriately?
Yeah, correct. A lot of textbooks talk about the fact that if you're leaning out or losing body weight, you can't concurrently add muscle mass. And a lot of times textbooks are 10 to 15 years behind, because that is not true, especially in the elite of elite athletes who are in extreme training environments. And the first paper to really definitively disprove that was this Sam Metler with Kevin Tipton, a protein expert at the time out of Birmingham, England, where they showed slightly higher protein intakes and strategic use of protein throughout the day, along with quite aggressive strength and conditioning and training program, while in a pretty profound caloric deficit resulted in subjects that lost 5% of their body weight, but in the high protein group concurrently added muscle mass. And again, that defies most textbook logic or what textbooks have. But any of us in the field, we've seen that. And there's now, a series of papers that have come out. Ina Garth, for example, out of Norway, has some great papers in this area showing that, in the elite athletes with pretty aggressive training programs and an increase in protein intake when leaning out can really help maintain muscle mass, and in some situations even gain muscle mass. Another key element of my the 9-year case study was that the general competition body weight, competition phase body weight for Hillary, for the subject in this study was completely unchanged throughout her career. However, the partitioning of that changed throughout her career, in that 9 years earlier, the body weight was still around 46 and a half kilos. She's very short, just to put that in perspective. World-class endurance athletes are incredibly petite. But 9 years later, she was the same body weight, but had an extra kilo of muscle mass on her.
It's amazing.
So she was leaner than ever. And most of that was a return from Switzerland here to the Canadian Sport Institute Pacific, where she was able to get on with a proper S&C coach. I was writing her S&C program in Switzerland, and I'm an endurance guy. It was a program that just kept her healthy, and it did, but it was not a performance program. And it was phenomenal to see late in her career, well into her 30s, after a child, her still putting on lean muscle mass and running better than ever. So, there's lots of lessons out of that case study.
Yeah, fantastic read, and definitely include that in the show notes here. And definitely want to respect your time here as well, Trent. Really appreciate you taking the time today. And if we shift back out, just kind of 30,000 feet for the recreational marathoner. So a lot of trainers or nutritionists or even docs listening in, we'll often see clients who are want to run a marathon to maybe improve their health, but they often have 10, 15, 20 pounds that they're also trying to lose during that event. And sometimes their fueling strategy can look a lot like Kipchoge's or an elite runner versus someone who's actually also trying to lose weight. Can you talk a little bit about the metabolic cost of running with extra body weight and maybe some of the nuances on fueling strategies there?
Yeah, certainly. I think, I think there's misconceptions that everything the elites do, if I'm a 4-hour marathoner, I should do. So first and foremost, in running specifically, running's a weight-dependent endurance sport. It's not like rowing or swimming or cycling where your weight's supported by either the water or some piece of equipment. So your risk for joint and or bone or neuromuscular overload is much greater in running than in the other sports. And that's primarily why triathletes and rowers and cyclists can do a 25 to 30 hour training week. But even your top Kenyan marathoners can only physically run in terms of their neuromuscular and joints and muscles 10 to 12 hours a week. So that's point number one. And then if you're profoundly overweight, that puts a lot more stress on the joints and everything else. So those joints can handle it, but it's really important in the training program to take things incredibly slow early. I see way too many recreational runners wanting to check the marathon box within a few months of starting a running program. And I think that there's certain high throughput running classes that overemphasize the marathon way too quickly. And people hate it. They get broken. They get injured. They limp through their marathon. They can brag about it at the water cooler on Monday, but they hate running, and that's it. They never go back to it. If you're 20, 30 pounds overweight and you want to get into running, a marathon is something you might consider in 4 to 5 years. And from a neuromuscular perspective of just slowly loading the joints, you might just start with a whole bunch of hiking uphill and downhill. Then you might start into some, like a little bit of running with hiking. Then you might start to get into some workouts with hiking. And guess what will happen? Your body weight will come down safely. You'll have much lower injury rates. Most of our society, unfortunately, is not patient enough to do those types of things. And they want to take the 16-week marathon program and have a holiday to New York, right? So,
For sure.
So that's step one from a neuromuscular perspective. And at that point, fueling's irrelevant. You're going so slow that 100% of fueling can be achieved by carbohydrate and fat that you've stored in your body. Even a very lean individual has enough body fat energy for about 20 to 25 marathons in a row. And when exercise intensity is that low and it's more hiking or very slow running, you don't need any fueling at that point. You don't need to be sucking back carbs. You need water. Hydration is still important.
Definitely.
But it's way overdone. The very pointy end of things, after 3 or 4 years and your body comp's gotten back down into a place that's good and you can survive 2-hour long runs and you're then at the point where you think you're going to start your first marathon. Yes, some fueling during that marathon will be important. And yes, practicing that will help you get through the marathon. That says you probably need about half the amounts per hour that the elite athlete does. So, maybe a gel or 2 gels an hour, no more than that, because you're moving at a much slower rate. You have a much higher dependence on fat oxidation, and therefore you don't need near as much external carbohydrate to support the race distance. The other thing I would recommend in this space, as being a marathon coach as well, or part-time, I dabble,
Nice.
is that I think that there's diminishing returns once you get out past about 2.5 to 3 hour long runs. The elites don't do that because, they can run a marathon and a long run in 2.5 hours and it's pretty easy for them. Very few elites run past 2.5 hours of duration. However, if your goal marathon is 4 to 5 hours, there's a gap. And so what I usually recommend there, and it's more from a psychological perspective, is that a few times in the build, if you have a 4 or 5 hour marathon goal, get outside, do your 2 to 3 hour long run, but then tack on 2 hours of walking. So that psychologically you've had a few 4 or 5 hour bouts outside, just from a headspace perspective. And then on race day, you're standing on the starting line. You've done it a couple of times, albeit maybe with 20 or 25% of your long run is walking, but you've done a few 4 or 5 hour bouts. But in those bouts, you're only running for 2.5 to 3 hours. And I think, again, from a neuromuscular perspective, it's safer. You won't lower your risk of injury. You'll recover better out of those long runs. But psychologically, you're still ready on race day to handle 4 or 5 hours out on the course. So that was a long answer, but hopefully your listeners can get some value out of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Fantastic advice and insights there, Trent. Really, really appreciate it. And last question for you here before we let you go. The men's marathon breaking the 2-hour mark. Is this a real possibility? And, is there a certain innovation where we might potentially see this coming from to support that goal?
Yeah. 5 years ago, I probably would have stated on a podcast like this that we would be hard pressed to see a sub 202 in the next 25 years, and here we are at 201.39. That was the biggest improvement on marathon performance in about 50 years. It was one of the most insane marathon outcomes in the era of diminishing returns. And we're still 1 minute and 39 seconds off the 2 hours. And he only, I think he took 1 minute and 20, about the same amount he took off the old world record. So I still think we're a stretch away from a sub 2. I think we need to see 57 low half marathons, and the world record right now is 57 minutes high before we start to see a sub 2. But I now will say, and I probably wouldn't have said it 5 years ago, I think I'll see it in my lifetime. The innovations for me have come in shoe design. They've come in fueling. They've come in training insights, and they've come in appreciation of drafting. The IAAF has put and is considering putting more rules in place around shoe design. So a few years ago, there was these shoes with springs in the heel that were outlawed.
Okay.
There was too much energy return on those. There's talk about them putting more strict rules in place around shoe design because the Nike Vaporflies, yes, do improve running economy and by about 4%. Now, that published paper was done in what I'll say are national class runners. You're never going to get a 4% improvement in running economy in Kipchoge. You're too close to the ceiling there.
For sure.
But even a 1 or 2% is a couple of minutes for him. And then I think the other thing within the rules of sport that could be done better and should have been done yesterday in Berlin is the drafting component. There's no reason why you couldn't have 20 drafters at the start of the race. There's nothing in the rules to prevent that. And by that, what I mean is perhaps there's some of the drafters only get to 5K and they drop out. And then some only get to 10K and drop out. And some just get to 20K. But you have drafters. You have rabbits for the rabbits, because there's only a handful of people that can bring Kipchoge to 30 or 35K. No Canadian can, but a Canadian could bring him to the 15K mark. And I think just having him tucked in the back, completely out of any wind draft, and then having rabbits help draft the really key rabbits so that they have energy past 25 and 30K to push the pace. I do think there's another 60 seconds right there, maybe 30 to 60 seconds right there that could have taken his time off of Berlin yesterday. I just think with better rabbits, he might have been 201 low. So
incredible.
So yeah, maybe I'm contradicting myself, but I do think I'll see it in my lifetime. But I still think we're a
little ways away yet.
10, 20 years away, but I don't know. I've been blown away in the last 3 years by Kipchoge and this breaking 2 and now the Berlin yesterday. So
awesome.
Maybe I'll eat my hat on this one. We'll see.
Fantastic, Trent. Well, listen, I really appreciate again you taking the time out today. Where can people stay connected with you and keep up with all your phenomenal research?
Yeah, just follow on Twitter, I guess. I'm usually pretty active there, and that's probably the best spot.